The night everyone laughed at me was the same night someone powerful taught an entire room what true worth looked like. I didn't know expensive chandeliers could make people feel so small until I stood beneath them carrying a silver tray that weighed less than my fear. The ballroom glittered with crystal, polished marble, and designer gowns that shimmered like they belonged in magazines I could never afford to buy. Every smile around me looked rehearsed. Every laugh sounded just a little too loud. At 25, I had worked enough double shifts to recognize the difference between genuine happiness and people performing success for one another. That Saturday night, I was only supposed to refill champagne glasses, smile politely, and disappear into the background before anyone remembered my name. I had ironed my black waitress uniform twice before leaving my tiny apartment in Queens because wrinkles were the one thing I could control. My rent was already 5 days late, my old Honda needed a repair I couldn't afford, and my younger brother's community college tuition was due the following week. None of those problems mattered once I stepped inside the Grand Ashford Hotel. Compared to everyone else in that room, I felt invisible. Invisible people survive by staying quiet. At least that had always been my rule. For nearly 2 hours, I floated from table to table, balancing trays, replacing glasses, memorizing faces that would probably never remember mine. I overheard conversations about private jets, investment portfolios, luxury homes in Aspen, and vacations that cost more than my yearly salary. I smiled every time someone thanked me, even when they never looked directly into my eyes. It wasn't personal. People rarely noticed the one serving them. Then everything changed because of a single accident. One guest backed away from a conversation without looking. His elbow bumped my tray. Crystal glasses tipped sideways. I managed to save most of them, but one flute slipped free and shattered against the polished floor. The sharp sound echoed across the ballroom like every conversation had suddenly stopped breathing. Heads turned toward me all at once. Heat rushed into my face. Before I could apologize, a woman wearing an elegant white gown sighed dramatically enough for half the room to hear. "I suppose standards aren't what they used to be," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Another guest chuckled. Someone whispered, "That's what happens when you hire people from anywhere." The laughter spread quietly at first, then louder as more guests joined in. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody offered to help me collect the broken glass. They simply watched as though embarrassment itself had become part of the evening's entertainment. I knelt carefully, reaching for the scattered pieces with trembling hands while pretending I couldn't hear the comments drifting through the crowd. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. I had promised myself years ago that I would never let strangers decide how much I was worth. Even so, promises become harder to keep when an entire ballroom is laughing at you. I took one slow breath, picked up another piece of crystal, and told myself that if I could survive this night, tomorrow would still come. What I didn't know was that someone had already walked through the grand entrance, and within seconds, every person who had laughed at me would wish they had remained silent. The laughter faded the instant the ballroom doors opened, although no one announced his arrival. They did not have to. Some people carried authority the way thunder carried rain. You felt it before you understood it. I remained kneeling on the marble floor, carefully gathering the last fragments of crystal into my shaking hands, pretending not to notice that every conversation had suddenly become little more than whispers. Curiosity made me glance toward the entrance. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped inside with the calm confidence of someone who had never questioned whether he belonged anywhere. He was not surrounded by noisy attention. He did not ask for it. It simply followed him. Men in dark suits walked several steps behind him without saying a word, their expressions disciplined and composed. Hotel executives who had ignored me all evening immediately straightened their posture as they greeted him with nervous smiles. Even the musicians softened their tempo without anyone giving instructions. I had never seen him before, yet somehow everyone else already knew exactly who he was. I lowered my eyes again. Whoever he might be had nothing to do with me. My only concern was cleaning the mess before the event manager decided I was more trouble than I was worth. I reached for one final piece of shattered crystal when another pair of polished shoes appeared in front of me. They stopped only a few feet away. I assumed someone wanted to walk past, so I shifted aside without looking up. Instead, silence grew heavier. It spread through the ballroom until even the clinking of silverware disappeared. Something felt different. People were no longer watching me because I had embarrassed myself. They were watching someone else. I slowly lifted my head. The man stood there, his steel blue eyes fixed not on the broken glass, but on me. There was no amusement in his expression, no pity either, only quiet observation, as though he were trying to understand a story no one else had noticed. I looked away first. People like him did not make eye contact with waitresses unless they needed another drink. Before I could stand, the event manager hurried toward us wearing the same nervous smile he reserved for wealthy donors. "Mr. Moretti, I sincerely apologize for the disturbance. We will have everything cleaned immediately." The name meant nothing to me, but judging by the sudden tension surrounding us, it clearly meant everything to everyone else. The manager turned toward me, his polite smile disappearing. "Grace, you should leave the ballroom until we decide whether your services are still needed tonight." My stomach dropped. Losing this job would mean missing rent. Missing rent meant choosing between groceries and keeping the lights on. I quietly nodded because arguing had never solved any problem in my life. As I started to rise, the woman in the white gown laughed again, this time softer but sharp enough for me to hear. At least she knows when to leave. A few nearby guests smiled politely, careful not to laugh too loudly now that the powerful visitor was present. I kept my eyes on the floor, determined to walk away with whatever dignity I still had. Then something unexpected happened. The man called Vincent Moretti did not continue toward the head table prepared for him. He did not acknowledge the executives waiting anxiously nearby. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, watching me as though everyone else in the ballroom had suddenly disappeared. And for reasons I could not begin to understand, I felt that the evening was no longer following the script everyone else had expected. I froze where I stood because nothing about that moment made sense. Every instinct told me to apologize again, quietly leave the ballroom, and hope someone would forget my mistake before the night was over. Instead, Vincent Moretti remained perfectly still, his attention resting on me while dozens of powerful people waited for him to acknowledge their greetings. The silence stretched long enough for the room to become uncomfortable. I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, the soft notes of the piano player hesitating between songs, even my own heartbeat echoing inside my ears. The event manager cleared his throat and forced another nervous smile. "Mr. Moretti, please allow us to escort you to your table. We have prepared everything for your arrival." Vincent did not even glance in his direction. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but every word carried across the ballroom without effort. Who was laughing? No one answered. Several guests looked at one another, hoping someone else would speak first. The woman in the white gown folded her arms confidently, as though she believed the question could not possibly concern her. Vincent repeated himself without raising his voice. I asked a simple question. Who laughed at her? The room became even quieter. I wished the polished marble floor would somehow open beneath my feet so I could disappear. This was no longer about a broken glass. Somehow I had become the center of attention in a room where people like me were never supposed to exist beyond serving drinks. The woman finally stepped forward with a polished smile that looked practiced enough to belong on a campaign poster. "Surely this is only a misunderstanding," she said. The young lady made an unfortunate mistake, and everyone simply reacted. Vincent slowly turned toward her. His expression never changed, yet something invisible shifted in the atmosphere. "Did she spill the drink on purpose?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "Well, no." "Did she insult anyone?" Another pause. "No." "Then explain what was amusing." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Around her, several guests lowered their eyes toward the floor, suddenly fascinated by anything except the conversation unfolding before them. Vincent looked back at me. "What is your name?" My throat felt dry. "Grace," I answered softly. "Grace Carter." He nodded once, as though committing it to memory. "How long have you worked here, Grace?" "Almost 11 months. Have you ever been disciplined before tonight?" I shook my head. "No, sir." He remained silent for another moment before asking the event manager, "Has she been a reliable employee?" The manager swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Moretti. She has always been dependable." "Then why were you prepared to dismiss your most dependable employee instead of addressing the people who chose to humiliate her?" The manager had no answer. Neither did anyone else. I could hardly breathe. My entire life had taught me that powerful people protected one another, not strangers wearing inexpensive uniforms. Yet the man standing a few feet away seemed completely uninterested in wealth, reputation, or social status. He cared only about fairness. For the first time since the crystal shattered across the marble floor, I lifted my head without shame. I met his eyes again, expecting to find sympathy. Instead, I found respect, and somehow that felt even more overwhelming. Then Vincent took one measured step toward me, and every person in the ballroom instinctively stepped back, creating a circle of silence around us, as though they already sensed that the next words out of his mouth would change far more than the rest of my evening. Vincent stopped an arm's length away from me, close enough for me to notice the faint scent of cedar and clean linen instead of expensive cologne. His attention never drifted toward the executives waiting impatiently nearby or the guests pretending they had never laughed a few minutes earlier. It remained fixed on me with a calm focus that felt strangely comforting. I lowered my eyes, unsure what someone like me was supposed to do when the most influential man in the room refused to look anywhere else. Then he did something so ordinary that it became unforgettable. A neatly folded white linen napkin had slipped from one of the serving trays and landed beside my shoes during all the confusion. Before I could bend to pick it up, Vincent reached down first. His movements were unhurried, almost effortless. He brushed away the tiny specks of crystal dust that still clung to the fabric and held it out toward me instead of handing it to an assistant. I accepted it with trembling fingers. "Thank you," I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. He gave a slight nod, then spoke clearly enough for every person in the ballroom to hear. "Stand up, Grace." There was no command in his tone. It sounded more like an invitation to remember something I had forgotten. I slowly rose to my feet. My shoulders were tense, and I instinctively looked toward the floor again, but Vincent quietly said, "Look forward." I did. The room that had seemed enormous only minutes earlier suddenly felt very small. Faces that had once carried amused smiles now looked uncertain. Some guests avoided eye contact entirely. Others stood perfectly still, waiting to see what would happen next. Vincent glanced around the ballroom before speaking again. Respect is not determined by income. It is revealed by character. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody even shifted in place. A person who works honestly deserves the same dignity as the person signing the checks. His words were not dramatic. They were simple, measured, and impossible to ignore. The woman in the white gown forced another smile. "Mr. Moretti, I am sure everyone understands that emotions simply got carried away for a moment." Vincent looked toward her with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. Kindness does not disappear because emotions become inconvenient. She had no response. The event manager nervously adjusted his tie. "We deeply regret how this situation unfolded." Vincent answered without raising his voice. "Regret has value only when it changes behavior." I could hardly believe the conversation unfolding around me. My entire life, I had accepted that people with influence rarely noticed those without it. Yet here I was, standing in the center of a ballroom, while someone every guest seemed to fear was speaking about dignity as though it mattered more than status. My hands finally stopped shaking. Something inside me, something I had buried beneath years of late bills, extra shifts, and quiet apologies, slowly began to lift. Vincent turned toward me once more. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Grace," he said, "never allow another person's opinion to become the measure of your value." I felt my eyes grow warm again, but this time it was not because of humiliation. It was because, for the first time in years, someone had spoken to me as though my worth had never depended on the uniform I wore. Then Vincent faced the room one final time, his steady voice carrying to every corner beneath the crystal chandeliers. "Remember this moment," he said. "The way you treat someone with no power tells the world exactly who you are." No one applauded. No one dared to speak. The silence itself became the lesson, and I realized that the evening, which had begun with laughter, had quietly transformed into something none of us would ever forget. The silence lingered for several long seconds after Vincent finished speaking, as though every person in the ballroom was waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. No one moved. No one dared to laugh again. Even the musicians remained still, their instruments resting quietly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. I stood there holding the folded linen napkin in my hands, wondering whether I had somehow stepped into another person's life. Nothing about the evening felt real anymore. Vincent looked at me for a brief moment. then slowly extended his hand. I stared at it without understanding. It was not an extravagant gesture. It was simply an open hand offered with quiet confidence, yet it carried more respect than I had received from most people in my entire life. My heart pounded as I placed my hand in his. His grip was steady, never forceful, never possessive, only reassuring enough to remind me that I no longer stood alone. He guided me one step forward until we faced the room together. Then he spoke in the same calm voice that had already transformed the atmosphere. "Every person here recognizes titles," he said. "Tonight, I would like you to recognize character instead." His eyes briefly met mine before returning to the crowd. Grace has shown more dignity in one difficult moment than many people display in a lifetime of privilege. I felt every face in the ballroom turn toward me again, but this time their expressions were different. The amusement had vanished. In its place was curiosity, uncertainty, and for some, unmistakable embarrassment. Vincent released my hand only after making certain I felt steady on my feet. Then he said the words that no one in the room seemed prepared to hear. "From this moment forward, you will address her with the same respect you expect for yourselves." He paused just long enough for the meaning to settle into every corner of the ballroom. Because a woman who refuses to lose her dignity after being humiliated deserves to be treated like a queen. My breath caught. I looked at him in complete disbelief, convinced I had misunderstood. He turned toward me with the faintest hint of a smile. "Stand proudly, my queen." The words were gentle, almost quiet, but they echoed through the ballroom more powerfully than any speech could have. Nobody reacted with laughter. Nobody questioned him. The phrase was not spoken as a claim of ownership or a grand performance. It sounded like a declaration of the respect he believed every human being deserved, especially someone who had nearly forgotten her own worth. I felt my eyes fill with tears again, but I blinked them away before they could fall. I had spent years believing confidence belonged only to people with money, influence, or famous last names. Yet standing beside Vincent, I realized confidence could also come from being seen for who you truly were. The woman in the white gown lowered her gaze. Several guests quietly stepped aside, creating a clear path through the ballroom without anyone asking them to move. The event manager approached me carefully. "Grace," he said, his voice noticeably softer than before, "I owe you an apology." I nodded politely because I did not know what else to do. Everything had changed too quickly for my mind to catch up. Vincent looked toward the grand windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline before speaking one final sentence. "Tonight is not about changing who Grace is," he said. "It is about reminding everyone else who they should have been from the beginning." At that moment, I understood that the evening had stopped being about a broken glass long ago. It had become something far greater, and somehow, without ever expecting it, I had become part of a story that every person in that ballroom would remember long after the lights went out. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but nothing felt the same. Conversations resumed in careful whispers instead of confident laughter, and every glance that had once looked through me now paused before moving away. I could almost feel people rewriting their first impression of me without saying a single word. Vincent did not celebrate what had happened. He simply nodded to one of the men standing quietly behind him. The gentleman, dressed in a dark navy suit, stepped forward and handed Vincent a slim leather folder. Vincent opened it for only a moment before speaking softly enough that I almost missed his words. "Please inform the appropriate people that beginning tomorrow morning, our foundation will conclude its partnerships with any organization that believes respect is optional." The man answered with a simple, "Yes, sir," before walking away to make several discreet phone calls. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Yet I watched the color slowly drain from several faces across the ballroom. The woman in the white gown reached for her phone with trembling fingers. Another guest hurried toward the hotel manager, whispering urgently. A businessman who had laughed the loudest earlier quietly excused himself and walked toward the exit without finishing his drink. I did not understand exactly what was happening, but I understood enough to realize that influence did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived with a quiet decision that changed everything. Vincent noticed my confused expression. "Actions always create consequences," he said calmly. "The kindest consequences help people remember who they wanted to become." I looked at him with surprise. "You are not trying to punish them?" He met my eyes for a brief moment. "No, Grace. Punishment rarely changes a heart. Accountability sometimes does. His answer stayed with me. It sounded nothing like the stories people whispered about powerful men. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only certainty. The event manager approached us again, this time carrying a small envelope with both hands. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "the hotel would like to apologize for this evening. We hope you will accept this gesture and continue working with us." I looked inside the envelope and immediately tried to hand it back. It contained a generous bonus that was larger than an entire month of my regular paycheck. "I cannot accept this," I said honestly. "I only came here to do my job." The manager seemed embarrassed. "You earned it." I gently shook my head. Respect should never have a price. Vincent watched the exchange without interrupting. When the manager finally stepped away, he looked at me with an expression I still could not fully understand. "You surprised me," he admitted. "Most people would have accepted it immediately." I smiled faintly. Money can solve many problems. It cannot erase how someone made another person feel. For the first time that evening, Vincent actually smiled back. It was small and genuine, transforming the serious expression he had worn since entering the ballroom. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why you stood taller than everyone else long before I arrived." His words settled deeply inside me. I realized he had never been impressed by my circumstances or interested in changing my social status. He had noticed something I had almost forgotten myself. Across the ballroom, guests continued speaking in hushed voices, while several quietly left the event earlier than planned. No one was forced to leave. No one was publicly embarrassed. They simply seemed eager to escape the memory of the choices they had made. Watching them disappear beneath the crystal chandeliers, I understood that the most lasting lessons were rarely taught through fear. They were taught when people were finally required to face the reflection of their own behavior. And for the first time in years, I felt that my voice, my dignity, and my future might actually matter. The applause never came, and somehow that made the moment feel even more genuine. People returned to their conversations, but they spoke more softly now, choosing every word with greater care than before. I glanced toward the towering windows where the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass like thousands of distant stars. For a brief second, I imagined walking out of the hotel, driving my aging Honda home, and pretending none of this had happened. That would have been easier, simpler, safer. Vincent seemed to notice the direction of my thoughts. "You were thinking about leaving," he said. I smiled awkwardly. "I still have a shift to finish." "No," he replied gently. "You were thinking about running away from being seen." His words caught me completely off guard because they were true. For years I had hidden behind uniforms, long work hours, and polite smiles because staying unnoticed felt less dangerous than hoping people would recognize my value. I looked down at my hands before answering. "People like me do not belong in rooms like this." Vincent folded his hands behind his back and looked around the ballroom. "Do you know what I see?" I shook my head. "I see people wearing expensive clothes." He paused for a moment. "Nothing more." I let out a quiet laugh despite myself. "You make it sound easy." "It was never easy," he answered. "It simply became necessary." I studied his face, searching for the arrogance I had expected from someone with so much influence, but I could not find it. Instead, I saw someone who seemed strangely tired beneath all the confidence, as though carrying responsibility had become heavier than carrying success. "Why did you help me?" I finally asked. "You did not even know me." He looked at the crystal chandelier above us before answering. "Sometimes knowing a person's character takes only one moment." I frowned slightly. "You only saw me drop a glass." "No," he said quietly. "I saw you humiliated, and I watched you choose dignity instead of bitterness." His answer settled into my heart more deeply than I wanted to admit. I took a slow breath. "I appreciate everything you have done tonight, but I cannot become part of your world." His expression remained calm. "Who asked you to?" I blinked in surprise. "Everyone keeps looking at me differently because you stood beside me." "That is their decision," Vincent replied. "Do not confuse their assumptions with my expectations." I felt a wave of relief mixed with embarrassment. Somewhere inside me, I had begun believing that his kindness came with invisible obligations. Instead, he seemed to expect nothing except honesty. "I do not need a throne," I said with a faint smile. "I only wanted to earn enough to pay my rent." For the first time that evening, Vincent laughed softly. It was warm, genuine, and completely unexpected. "Grace," he said, "that is exactly why you deserve every opportunity that comes your way." I slowly shook my head. I do not want opportunities because someone powerful noticed me. I met his eyes without looking away. If my future changes, I want it to happen because I earned it. He held my gaze for several quiet seconds before giving a respectful nod. Then I will never offer you charity. He extended his hand once more, not to lead me, but to seal a promise. Only a fair chance. I accepted the handshake without hesitation, and somehow that simple agreement felt more valuable than any amount of money. Neither of us realized that across the ballroom, someone had quietly captured the entire exchange on a phone, and by sunrise the next morning, one unexpected video would begin changing both of our lives in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The gala finally ended just after midnight, but my thoughts refused to leave the ballroom. I changed out of my uniform inside the employee locker room, folded it carefully into my worn canvas bag, and stepped outside into the cool New York air. The city sounded different after everything that had happened. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Distant sirens blended into the rhythm of late-night traffic, and the wind carried the familiar scent of rain drifting in from the Hudson River. My old Honda started on the second attempt, just as it always did. I smiled to myself, grateful that at least one thing in my life still behaved exactly as expected. During the drive home, I replayed every conversation with Vincent, wondering why someone with unlimited influence had chosen to spend his evening defending a waitress he had never met. By the time I reached my apartment building in Queens, exhaustion had finally caught up with me. I climbed the narrow staircase, unlocked the door, and found my younger brother Ethan asleep at the kitchen table with his textbooks spread across the surface. A half-finished math assignment sat beside a cold cup of coffee. I gently placed a blanket over his shoulders before heading to my room. My phone vibrated the moment I set it on the nightstand. Then it vibrated again, and again. Within seconds, dozens of notifications filled the screen. Friends I had not spoken to in years were sending messages. Former coworkers were asking if the woman in a viral video was really me. Confused, I opened one of the links. Someone had uploaded a short recording from the ballroom. The video began with guests laughing while I knelt beside the shattered glass. Then Vincent entered the frame. His questions were calm. His words were clear. The moment he told me to stand proudly had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By the time I refreshed the screen, the number had climbed even higher. Thousands of comments appeared every minute. Some people praised the stranger who defended a waitress. Others shared stories about times they had been overlooked because of their jobs. Teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, janitors, mechanics, cashiers, and restaurant workers all wrote the same message in different words. They did not see themselves in Vincent. They saw themselves in me. I kept scrolling until one particular comment made me stop. It read, "Real power is not making people fear you. Real power is making the forgotten feel seen." I quietly set the phone down and stared out the small bedroom window toward the distant skyline. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Vincent sat alone in his office overlooking the city. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. "Sir," he said carefully, "the video from tonight has become the most discussed topic on several platforms." Vincent accepted the tablet, watched only a few seconds, and handed it back. "How is Grace?" he asked. His assistant looked surprised. According to the hotel manager, she declined additional compensation and went home after finishing her shift. Vincent nodded almost imperceptibly. "Good." The assistant hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing. We received a message from someone claiming they recognize her family name." Vincent's expression changed for the first time that night. It was subtle, but unmistakable. "From where?" he asked. The assistant opened a small folder. "The message mentions an event that happened nearly 20 years ago." Vincent slowly looked toward the lights beyond his office window, his thoughts suddenly somewhere far beyond the gala. In that quiet moment, neither of us knew that the night which had introduced two strangers to each other was also about to uncover a forgotten connection that had begun long before either of us understood our lives were destined to cross. 3 days later, my life still looked ordinary from the outside. I woke before sunrise, packed a simple lunch, reminded Ethan not to skip breakfast, and drove my old Honda through the familiar streets of Queens. Yet everywhere I went, people recognized me from the video. A cashier smiled and thanked me for reminding her that kindness still existed. An elderly man at a gas station quietly paid for my coffee before I could reach my wallet. None of them admired me because I had become famous. They simply understood what it felt like to be invisible. Late that afternoon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it until I heard the calm voice on the other end. It was Vincent's assistant. He politely asked whether I would be willing to meet Mr. Moretti for a brief conversation. Curiosity outweighed hesitation, and the following evening I found myself walking into a quiet library inside one of Vincent's office buildings instead of another extravagant ballroom. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded the room, and sunlight poured through wide windows overlooking the city. Vincent stood beside a wooden table holding an old photograph inside a protective folder. He greeted me with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. There were no cameras, no reporters, no audience. He placed the photograph on the table between us. I stared at the faded image of a neighborhood food drive from nearly 20 years earlier. A young woman smiled beside a folding table filled with donated groceries. Standing next to her was a small boy no older than 8, wearing an oversized winter coat and holding a paper bag with both hands. My breath caught. The woman was my mother. The little boy was Vincent. He spoke softly, almost as though he were remembering the moment instead of explaining it. My father lost everything that winter. My mother was working 2 jobs. We were too proud to ask for help, but your mother never waited for people to ask. She simply noticed. My eyes filled with tears as memories returned. I remembered helping my mother organize canned food and blankets after school. She always said that the strongest people were the ones who quietly carried someone else's burden without expecting applause. Vincent smiled gently. She treated me with dignity when my family had nothing. I never forgot her face, but I never learned what became of her until someone recognized your last name after the video. I lowered my eyes. She passed away several years ago. Silence settled between us, not awkward but respectful. Vincent nodded slowly. Then allow me to thank the person she raised. I shook my head with a small smile. She would tell you that kindness is never a debt to repay. It is a gift that keeps moving. He looked out across the skyline before answering. Then perhaps that is what happened that night. Your mother gave a frightened boy his dignity many years ago. Without realizing it, she taught him how to return it when someone else needed it most. We stood there quietly, watching the afternoon light stretch across the wooden floor. I realized that destiny had not been written by power, wealth, or influence. It had been written by one ordinary act of compassion that refused to disappear with time. As I left the building, I understood that the greatest title anyone could ever receive was not earned through money, status, or fear. It was earned by becoming the kind of person who could see value in someone long before the rest of the world ever noticed.